The Supreme Court has delivered a decisive check on executive authority, striking down President Trump's sweeping tariff plan and reaffirming Congress's constitutional power over trade and taxation. This ruling wasn't just about tariffs, it was a clear statement that long-term economic strategy cannot be dictated by unilateral executive action. The justices clarified that emergency powers are not blank checks for presidents to bypass Congress and enact broad economic policies. The decision resets the balance of power, forcing the debate over America's global economic role back into Congress, where it belongs. While the court didn't solve the underlying economic issues, it made clear that future trade policy must be shaped by the democratic process, not executive decree. This landmark ruling ensures that both parties must now engage in the hard work of building legislative consensus on America's economic future. President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were born from the belief that decades of unfair global trade practices had left the U.S. at a disadvantage. For years, American leaders and workers alike voiced concerns that international competitors were not playing by the same rules, leading to lost jobs and shuttered factories across the country. The administration argued that the U.S. had been too lenient, allowing foreign nations to benefit at the expense of American prosperity. The administration cited a $93 billion trade deficit as proof that foreign producers were favored over American workers. This deficit, they claimed, was not just a number, but a symbol of deeper structural imbalances in the global trading system. Economists and policy advisors pointed to years of mounting deficits as evidence that urgent action was needed to protect domestic industries. Framing the trade imbalance as a national emergency, the White House used this justification to bypass Congress. By invoking emergency powers, the administration sought to act swiftly, arguing that traditional legislative processes were too slow to address the crisis at hand. This move was controversial, sparking debate over executive authority and the proper role of Congress in shaping trade policy. The plan, a universal 10% tariff on all imports, escalating to 15% and 20% with no exceptions, was an unprecedented move meant to force global realignment. Unlike previous tariffs that targeted specific countries or industries, this sweeping measure was designed to send a clear message. The U.S. would no longer tolerate what it saw as unfair trade. The tariffs aimed to make imports more expensive, boost American manufacturing, and pressure other countries to lower their own trade barriers. Supporters hoped this would revitalize domestic production, create new jobs, and restore pride in American-made goods. Critics, however, warned of higher prices for consumers and potential disruptions to global supply chains. Retaliatory tariffs, like a proposed 50% duty on Brazilian goods, signaled a new, aggressive America First approach. These countermeasures were intended to demonstrate that the U.S. would respond forcefully to any nation that tried to undermine its economic interests, escalating tensions with key trading partners. This was not just economic policy, but a tool of foreign policy, declaring that the old rules of global trade no longer applied. The administration sought to leverage America's economic power to reshape international relationships and force other countries to the negotiating table on U.S. terms. The message was clear. The U.S. would use its economic might to reshape the world order in its favor, signaling a new era of assertive American leadership on the global stage. To enact the tariffs without Congress, the administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This law was originally designed to give the president rapid authority to respond to sudden, unexpected foreign crises, such as national security threats or international emergencies, not to address ongoing long-term issues like chronic trade deficits. By using IEPA in this context, the administration was treading into uncharted territory, raising immediate questions about the scope and intent of the law. By declaring the trade imbalance an extraordinary threat to the United States, the president sought to unlock sweeping powers that would otherwise be out of reach. This move allowed the executive branch to bypass the usual legislative process and act unilaterally, a significant departure from how economic policy is typically made. Critics from across the political spectrum argued this was a dangerous stretch of executive authority. They warned that if left unchecked, it could set a precedent where any president could declare emergencies over routine policy disagreements, effectively seizing economic control without meaningful oversight from Congress or the courts. Historically, IEPA had never been used to impose tariffs. Its text doesn't explicitly grant the power to tax imports, a responsibility that the Constitution assigns directly to Congress. This raised fundamental questions about the separation of powers and the limits of executive authority. The administration, however, argued that regulating trade in times of emergency necessarily included the power to tax or restrict imports. Opponents saw this as a clear constitutional overreach, warning that it could erode the checks and balances at the heart of American democracy. Legal scholars and constitutional experts warned that using IEPA in this way would set a precedent for unchecked executive power, potentially allowing future presidents to sidestep Congress on a wide range of economic issues. The central legal fight became clear. Could the president use emergency powers to impose broad tariffs, or was this a violation of the separation of powers that underpins the U.S. government? The courts would soon be called upon to decide whether this modern, expansive interpretation of executive authority could stand, or if it would be reined in to preserve the constitutional balance. The outcome of this legal battle would not only determine the fate of the tariffs, but also define the limits of presidential power in economic affairs for generations to come. The legal battle over the tariffs boiled down to a core constitutional question: who controls foreign commerce? The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate trade and impose taxes. Challengers argued the President had overstepped, using IEPA to rewrite tariff law by executive fiat. The administration countered that modern threats require swift executive action, and that Congress had enabled this by passing IEPA. This was a classic clash: strict constitutional limits versus the demands of modern governance. Proponents saw the president as chief protector. Opponents warned that unchecked emergency powers would erode checks and balances. The outcome would determine whether the president could bypass Congress on fundamental economic policy. The Trump tariff plan faced immediate and widespread legal challenges, as states, major corporations, and trade groups quickly filed lawsuits in the Court of International Trade. They argued that the administration's sweeping use of tariffs overstepped executive authority and threatened to disrupt established economic relationships. The court responded swiftly, issuing an injunction that temporarily blocked the tariffs. Judges expressed serious doubts that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, was ever intended to address long-term trade deficits. They warned that allowing such a broad interpretation could set a dangerous precedent, giving the president unchecked power over trade policy. The Trump administration immediately appealed, insisting that the president must have the flexibility to respond to evolving economic threats, including those posed by foreign competitors. Officials argued that national security and economic stability were at stake, but appellate judges remained skeptical. During hearings, they questioned whether a decades-old trade imbalance truly constituted an emergency under the law, or if the administration was stretching the statute beyond its intended limits. As the legal battle intensified, businesses and global partners were left in a state of uncertainty. Many companies delayed investments and supply chain decisions, unsure of how the courts would ultimately rule. The stakes were high, and the world watched as the case raced toward the Supreme Court. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ultimately sided with the challengers. The justices made it clear that the power to tax and regulate foreign commerce belongs to Congress, not the president, reaffirming a core principle of the Constitution. The court ruled that the administration's use of IEPA in this context was an unconstitutional end run around the legislative process, and that such actions could not stand. This decision was a powerful defense of the separation of powers, setting a clear and lasting limit on presidential authority in economic matters, and reinforcing the vital role of Congress in shaping the nation's trade policy. While courts debated, businesses and consumers faced real turmoil. The proposed tariffs meant sudden cost spikes for companies relying on global supply chains, especially small and medium-sized firms. Many faced existential threats, unable to absorb or pass on the new costs. Retaliatory tariffs, like the 50% duty on Brazilian goods, threatened entire industries. Legal back and forth created chaos. Businesses couldn't plan, invest, or price products with confidence. The uncertainty itself became a tax, stifling growth and fueling anxiety. The Supreme Court's decision brought immediate relief, preventing price hikes and stabilizing the economy. For now, businesses and families could plan for the future with renewed confidence. The Supreme Court's ruling against IEPA-based tariffs didn't strip the presidency of all trade powers. The decision was narrow, focused on misuse of emergency powers, not a blanket ban on executive tariff authority. The president still wields significant tools like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, allowing tariffs for national security reasons. Section 301 of the Trade Act lets the president retaliate against unfair foreign practices as seen in tariffs on Chinese goods. These powers, delegated by Congress, remain potent, though they face their own legal challenges. Older statutes, like Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, also allow for retaliatory tariffs. The court clarified broad universal tariffs require congressional action, but targeted executive powers endure. The balance of trade authority remains contested, but the president's arsenal is far from empty. The Supreme Court's decision settled one fight, but the war over trade policy rages on. Lawsuits continue over the president's use of Section 232 and the fairness of tariff exemption processes. Plaintiffs argue that broad definitions of national security turn trade laws into blank checks for protectionism. The outcomes could further limit, or affirm, presidential discretion on tariffs. Political debate over trade remains fierce, with both parties rethinking past policies. Congress faces pressure to reclaim or clarify its constitutional trade powers. The struggle over America's role in the global economy is far from over. The Supreme Court's rejection of the tariff plan reshapes the balance of power between Congress and the president. By blocking emergency powers for long-term economic policy, the court forces future trade debates back into Congress. Presidents must now seek legislative consensus for sweeping trade changes or rely on narrower statutory tools. The decision reassures global partners that U.S. trade policy can't be upended overnight. Yet, the appetite for protectionism remains strong, ensuring trade will stay central in American politics. This case reaffirms that power must be divided and laws made through debate, not executive fiat. The rules of engagement are now clearer. America's economic future will be shaped by democratic process, not unilateral action.